is what we are going to study today. এটা আমরা পড়বো আজকে। দেখা যাচ্ছে তো? You can see this?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so as an introduction, let me tell you that the Anglo-Saxon people, they left the largest and a varied prose literature which has survived, and the prose literature actually it's more in number and more in bulk really than their poetry. As you know, secular and religious poetry, Christian poetry, of course you do not have Christian poetry in your syllabus, but Anglo-Saxon prose is a much larger quantity than the poetry. And the prose works are actually, they when they were written, they were copied by the different monks in the monasteries. A number of monasteries where the scholars used to copy these works from the author's manuscript. And actually, these prose manuscripts were preserved. They were preserved in monastic and cathedral libraries. And during those times, these monks were interested in mainly spiritual or religious works. So, a work would have little chance of survival if it did not appeal to the concerned monk. And often some works were destroyed by the monks where the language spelling was dated. Just a moment. হ্যালো, হ্যাঁ বলো। আমি তো নিচ্ছি ক্লাস। তুমি কোন লিঙ্কটা করেছো বলো তো? তুমি ওই সিএএস যেটা, ওইটা তো? আচ্ছা, তুমি একবার মানে বেরিয়ে গিয়ে আবার জয়েন করো তো। আমি তো তোমাকে দেখতে পাচ্ছি না, এখানে তো অনেকেই রয়েছে, স্টুডেন্টরা রয়েছে এখানে। ঠিক আছে, চেষ্টা করো তো, দেখছি। Okay, so let us come back to this presentation. As I was saying, that so you will find that often some manuscript was destroyed by these monks because perhaps to them the language spelling appeared to be dated, and a modern version was kept. And there are very few prose works of literary flavor. They are either religious in character or they're of a documentary nature. They are documentaries, that is, they record uh, certain events, as we find in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, or they communicate certain facts. So let us now move on to this next slide, where the first, actually, there are a number of Anglo-Saxon prose writers, and the first person whom we need to talk about when we come to Anglo-Saxon prose is the Venerable Bede. He was an Anglo-Saxon monk, really, a Benedictine monk, who lived in the monastery in Yarrow, or Jarrow as it was called. Now, his dates are from, as you can see here, 673 to 735 AD. And I would start with this quotation from one of his writings. Quote, "The goal of wisdom is the knowledge of the divine essence." Unquote. So this is from Bede's writing. So this is actually the essence of what Bede was trying to achieve during his lifetime. So knowledge consisted in knowing God, in knowing God, and so obviously Bede was thinking about this, and he dedicated his whole life to this. We find in Bede a deep religious commitment and a desire to explore as deep as possible into religious matters. Uh, so we'll find that in Bede, we would find a kind of a quest for illumination, an inner light, quest for an inner light, that is spiritual rapture and joy. And he does not give only bare information to us, but also it is tinged with this very ardent devotion, spiritual devotion that is very well perceived in his works. So he was born in 673 AD near a place called Durham. He was brought up by Benedict, who was a Northumbrian clergyman. Uh, Benedict was actually a builder of churches, and he was a man of learning, a very knowledgeable person. He had a very large library, and in 682, the beautiful monastery at Jarrow was completed under the supervision of Benedict. Bede came to settle in Jarrow forever. So Bede came to live there at a very young age. As a young boy, he studied assiduously, and as a youth, he became famous as a scholar. So, from his early age, he devoted himself to studies and the study of religion and all that. So he was a liberal scholar. And apart from theology, which dealt with Christian doctrine, theories as such, and language, he also studied history, poetry, medicine, and mathematics. So during those times in the monasteries, all these subjects were taught. So quite a varied list of subjects, as you can see. He pursued knowledge for its own sake, not for utility, not for any utilitarian purpose. That so, as you can well understand, that he uh, loved to study, and as such, he studied these subjects. Now, next we'll go to the next slide, and we will see actually Bede's output, that is his works, is quite vast, and these include commentaries on the scriptures, the saints' lives, biographies, and famous churchmen and women. So he wrote a lot, a number of books, which were quite well known during his time. His most famous work is the Ecclesiastical History of the English Nation. So, this is the name of this book, which actually for which Bede is famous. And till today, this book can be sometimes it is studied. It is really a very good book on all the theological aspects. As you can see, the ecclesiastical means the religious aspect, the religious history of the English nation, which he had written. And uh, I'll just talk about briefly what is there in this book. But for the timing, let us look at the other. What else can we learn about this remarkable individual? There is a total and implicit belief in the teachings of Christ. This can be noticed in his works, and this particular feature gives his works, a density in tone. So Bede lived in an orderly environment in a monastery where there was strict discipline and order, as you can well imagine, and all his works are very carefully compiled. His style, his prose style, is quite lucid, that is, it is easy to understand, but it is also mixed with some stately, majestic phrases. So it is a kind of a mixture of the simple language, lucid language, along with stately and majestic uh, phrases. So, this particular chronicle, actually, the ecclesiastical history of the English nation, it is one of the very most important chronicles before the Norman conquest, what we have of the religious history, what is there in Anglo-Saxon prose. So, this is what Bede is famous for. Now, I'll just go to this particular work and tell you something about uh, what is there in this particular book. And later on, we will move on to, as you are well aware of, the name of King Alfred the Great. Uh, he translated this particular work, and we have come to know what it contained. So, before that, before going into this work, I'll just tell you something about the uh, some early prose works before Bede, that is, and these were actually some of the translations made by the Roman missionaries when there was Roman rule in Great Britain, and they had translated some works from Latin, and these missionaries, they had a background in classical learning, and uh, among the varied subjects of Anglo-Saxon prose, the earliest prose is found in the laws because it was considered most utilitarian to the society. Ain Shamondhyo. So it was related to the laws. Obviously, the Romans needed and they framed a number of laws because they were the rulers, they were governing Great Britain. And we do find that many of the laws, they were based on certain religious codes. So uh, now these had the laws, that is, they had three elements. One was religious, another was social, and that is social decorum, what was right and what was wrong, what should be done, what was permissible in society, and the punishment that would ensue if anyone sort of did not obey the law. So there were these three aspects. Uh, Now there were also charters. Uh, in 743 AD, the first charter was fully written in English, and During those times, as you can well imagine, writing was a very laborious job. Not many people were involved in writing, and it was also very expensive. So, uh, as you know, that poetry, which we studied, Anglo-Saxon heroic poetry, it was composed orally, মৌখিকভাবে composed হয়েছিল, but prose was written down. So it is much easier to remember poetry than prose for obvious reasons, for rhymes and all that. So prose was written down, and it was actually King Alfred, and before that, there were some other prose writers like Elfric and Ulfstan. Will be also touching upon them, upon their contribution. But King Alfred was a pioneer in the field of Anglo-Saxon prose, in the kind of, you can say, dissemination of knowledge. And let us now come back to Bede's work, which we were looking at, that is the ecclesiastical history of the English nation. So, what's there in this particular book? So, regarding the contents, we can say that uh, in the first place, you will find that this work by Bede had uh, a description of Great Britain. That's the first thing that was there. Great Britain, or Albion as it was called, Albion, and it included the position, the size, the products, the climate, and the descriptions of large towns, and the five languages that were spoken during those times in Great Britain. So, what were these languages? Number one was British, number two was Scottish, number three was Celtic, number four was Latin, and the last one was Saxon. So, these are the five languages that were spoken in Great Britain during this time, during when Bede wrote this work. And the next thing that is mentioned in this work is the history of England from the invasion of Julius Caesar, which occurred around 55 to 54 BC, to his own day, that is, to Bede's own day. So he has uh, sort of written down the history of England from those earliest times to his own day. And Bede, he concentrated on the events concerning the church and the spread of Christianity. So, obviously, he was a clergyman, he was a monk, and he was interested quite uh, expectantly, was interested in religious matters. And there are biographical sketches of saints, as we know that he had written saints' lives, and of eminent church figures, including such personalities as Pope Gregory, missionary Aidan, Aidan, missionary Aidan, Abbess Hild, Hild, or she was also known as Abbess Hilda. Uh, if you have read your Anglo-Saxon Christian poetry part from your the books that I had mentioned, that is Albert William J. Long's book, you will find mentioned this particular abbess Hilda, where Cadmon, uh, used to live in that abbey, and Abbess Hilda was the she was the person responsible for kind of this abbey, looking after this abbey. Now, these biographies would provide the models of good life. So these were all about religious personalities, and they were presented as models to the common people. That they were all models of good life. Bede examines the church doctrines and their validity or otherwise, and the religious disputes between various religious groups. He also makes a plea, that is an appeal for unity. And the book ends with the departure of the Romans and the arrival of the Viking invaders. So uh, this is the first part of this book, and actually, not the first part, this is about the whole book, what is there inside this book. And I will now just uh, read to you certain passages of interest so that you will be able to understand uh, what Bede was writing about. What did he mention in this particular book? So the first passage, it concerns the arrival of Saint Augustine in 597 AD, and he uh, was the first missionary who arrived, and with that, the Christianization of Great Britain began. His famous encounter with King Ethelbert, Ethelbert, uh, who converted to Christianity along with his nobles. So, Saint Augustine uh, converted this king, Ethelbert, into Christianity. And next comes the conversion of Edwin of Northumbria by Bishop Paulinus. And at first, Edwin was reluctant, but later on, he had a kind of a moment of illumination, and he ultimately embraced Christianity. And next, we have the conversion of Oswald of Northumbria, who became an extremely devout Christian. And uh, his story is also related by Bede. And next, we have the detailed account of the Irish missionary Aidan, Aidan, and his dedicated efforts to spread Christianity. And Bede in this book says that uh, missionary Aidan had three qualities which made him ideal. So, what were these three qualities? As mentioned by Bede, these included gentleness, goodness, and moderation. Gentleness, goodness, and moderation. And moderation, of course, would mean that he had no excessive desire for anything. So he behaved in a very temperate way. He was not a greedy person. Next, we have the story of Cadmon's hymn at Abbess Hill's monastery in Whitby. So, this monastery was in Whitby, Whitby. And the story ends with a moving account of Cadmon's death, where till his last breath he uttered the words of God. As Bede says, quote, crossed himself and commanded his spirit to his hands, unquote. So This is related by Bede how, even in his last hours, Cadmon was an extremely religious man. And there are, so what was the purpose of Bede in writing about these accounts, about these conversions and all that? And uh, as you can understand that Bede's quest was actually God, and he tries to show to the common people God's goodness and, uh, of course, the importance of embracing Christianity as a religion that is also there. And in the last part, we have the moving story of Bede's death, and he dictated to his pupil Cuthbert on his deathbed, and the last words were the translation of St. John's Gospel. So he died after completing this translation, and uh, there is a sense of fulfillment in this. That is, he was able to complete what he had undertaken to do, and then his death came. So that is the account of Venerable Bede. Venerable means a person who is greatly knowledgeable and who is, according to the Roman Catholic Church, who has been given a kind of some kind of responsibility in religious matters. So, Bede is, of course, the first Anglo-Saxon prose writer that we would we would consider. And as I said, King Alfred had chosen five texts to translate from Latin into English, and Bede's text was one of the primary texts. That was the first one. So I hope you have been able to followed what I have tried to tell you here, the contribution of Bede to Anglo-Saxon prose. Now, let us move on to Elfric, contribution of Elfric to Anglo-Saxon prose. And uh, we will now come to Elfric and see how, of the makers of Anglo-Saxon prose, the name of Elfric comes next to that of Alfred. So I'll consider Alfred later because he's the most important uh, kind of writer or person that we can find, whom we find in this Anglo-Saxon prose section. So I'll be doing him later on. A solid foundation for Anglo-Saxon prose was laid by Alfred, and Elfric added to it perfection and force. So while Alfred gave it strength and durability, Elfric enriched it with grace and lucidity. His contribution to the growth of English prose was really remarkable. Elfric, as he himself has admitted, was a pupil of the monastic school which was founded by this monk called Ethel Old, and this was at Abingdon, this place called Abingdon. The exact year of Elfric's birth is not known, but from his own account, his association with the cathedral at Winchester is well evident. It is well evident that he was a scholar and he had a religious training. However, King Alfred had no such religious training. That is quite obvious uh, because he was a king. Of course, he had a country to rule. Consequently, Elfric's style was much more impressive and learned than Alfred's. So that is quite natural and expected. Of the exact nature of Ælfric's work, little is actually known. It is supposed that he wrote in the first year of the 11th century. Of his writing, colloquium and Catholic homilies deserves particular mention. It is religious works, of course, and they have established his name as one of the architects of Anglo-Saxon prose. So his colloquium and Catholic homilies, these are the most important writings. Now, the colloquium of Ælfric is meant for teaching by conservation. This is conceived in quite an interesting way. Uh, as you can see, that there is a conversation. Now, actually, this term colloquium, it means an academic conference or seminar, an academic conference or seminar. So, uh, it is a kind of a dialogue, or it is a conversation between different people. So it is a conversation between a teacher, a novice. A novice means someone who doesn't know much, and he has come to know, come to study, and a number of persons representing different trades and occupations. So uh, this is a conversation between all these people, and it is on religious matters. That is quite obvious. Catholic homilies. Now, what does his Catholic homilies consist of? It consists of the compilation and translations made by him from the works of the celebrated churchmen. So the different important churchmen, what they had written, Ælfric translated their works. It comprises 120 homilies in three groups of 40. So there are three groups, each comprising of 40 homilies, meant for those men to read who do not know Latin. So there were many people during those times, common people, who did not know Latin, and for them, Ælfric translated these Latin from the Latin original. The three series of 40 sermons each and the commemoration of various saints venerated, I means respected by the Catholic Church, form the whole work. So there are three series of 40 sermons each, and uh, there are the commemoration, that is, Ælfric remembers or writes about these various saints who were extremely respected in the Catholic Church. These homilies exhibit Ælfric's style in its maturity. His rhythmic and alliterative expression, no doubt, causes monotony in their excesses, but they closely uh, resemble the ballad verse, and they were thus quite attractive to lay audiences. So they appealed to the lay audience, means the common people who were not so knowledgeable. To Ælfric, credit may be given also for the compilation of vocabulary, which is a crude version. This should be a crude version of Latin English dictionary. So, also, the vocabulary was built up by Ælfric. So, all these things, this colloquium, then the Catholic homilies, and this uh, vocabulary building that Ælfric undertook. So that is the contribution of Ælfric. I will now move on to Ulfstan. Uh, Not Alfred, but actually just a few more important information about Ælfric. Let us look into that. So he is generally taken as the greatest prose writer of Anglo-Saxon period. So Ælfric has that reputation, and he is also honored as the most distinguished theologian come prose writer. He deserves a high admiration for his simple yet forceful mode of instructing Christian precepts, that is, theories. His influence on English prose is found to last long even after his death, probably which took place in 1020. Elfric, as we found, that he was a pupil of the monastic school which Athelwold founded, uh, uh, that was in Abingdon, and he wrote in the first years of the 11th century. So the colloquium is that we had mentioned in the earlier slide, which we saw. It was for teaching Latin by conversation. So as we said that he wanted to teach Latin by conversation. So it was an easy mode of teaching Latin. And the vocabulary, which was the first Latin English dictionary, as we saw, and his homilies are most famous, his compilation and translations from the fathers of the church. So Alfred's prose, unlike that of Alfred, is written not to be read, but to be spoken to the people in the conventional tone of a priest delivering a sermon. So it is a kind of hearing a priest in church who is delivering a sermon to the people. It has therefore a rhythm which brings it near to verse. So a very verse-like kind of a poetical quality that is there in Elfric's prose works. Its sentences are divided into sections more or less equivalent to the metrical line, and it is frequently alliterative. So, as you know, alliteration is one of the major characteristics of Anglo-Saxon poetry. So, since Elfric's prose is also, it uh, resembles, or it really approaches towards a poetical quality. It has an alliterative quality as well. For this reason, scholars were long uncertain whether to classify it as verse or prose. So, it has such a kind of a mixed quality, both of prose and of verse. It celebrates the saints as the Scots once sang the deeds of warriors. As you know, the Scop, it means minstrel. And so, as we saw in Anglo Saxon heroic poetry, uh, when Scots were reciting, they were composing and reciting the exploits of different heroes, including Beowulf, including Walter or Walter, including Finn, such other Anglo-Saxon heroes which we have read. Here, what is being done is Elfric is celebrating the saints, so the religious personalities, and this poetic prose marks a great advance on that of Alfred. So obviously, Alfred did not know very good Latin, so he had to take the help of other people, as we will see later. It aims at beauty, measure, and harmony. It is remarkably clear and finished. It is a kind of a finished product. So there is much less awkwardness and effort in the connection of phrases than in Alfred's writings. So it makes for a very smooth poetical reading. In fact, the author is consciously literate even when he is using the vulgar tongue, that is English, and he excuses himself with some shame for the popular character of his translation of the Latin homilies, pleading the ignorance of his fellow countrymen. So, what Elfric is saying that I am feeling embarrassed that I have to use this Anglo-Saxon tongue to render into sort of translate these lofty passages about the saints, which are written in Latin, because otherwise the common people, my fellow countrymen, they would not be able to understand. So that was his kind of plea, what he said, that I am doing this. So I hope you have kind of understood about Bede and Elfric. So I'll stop here actually because the next portion is a bit long. So the portion related to Alfred, we'll have to do that in detail, and Ulfstan later on. Ulfstan is the last Anglo-Saxon prose writer whom we would be considering. So hopefully it is clear to you. So have you understood, Kota? Any problem that you would like to point out? That so we begin with Bede, and then we come to Elfric, and I'll then in my next class, which is tomorrow. Uh, Tomorrow I have a class with you. That is Tuesday. Do I have a class with you? Yes, I have at 2 p.m. Okay, it's written 1 p.m., but I'll be doing. Actually, I'll be doing philology with you. So, two classes on philology and two classes on Anglo-Saxon literature so far. So, I'll be doing Latin influence. I'll be continuing with that. Latin influence I had already started. So, we'll be doing that. Okay, so